For generations, knowledge about Indigenous history and culture was overlooked, dismissed, and even intentionally erased, as the residential school's experience amply demonstrated. Times have changed, and an ambitious new project is putting some of that back on the map. Literally. It's called the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, and the 4-volume collection addresses the real lack of resources about Indigenous history. Here to tell us more, Charlene Bearhead. She is Educational Advisor for the Atlas and the first Education Lead with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And Julian Brave NoiseCat, a writer, community organizer, and contributor to the Atlas, and we are delighted to welcome both of you to talk about what is truly a gorgeous and extraordinary achievement. Well done. This is absolutely spectacular. Where did the idea come from, Charlene?
The idea for the Atlas actually came from Canadian Geographic in response to the Canada 150 initiative. And so when Canadian Geographic approached me about doing my small part in this huge process, it was in fact the only Canada 150 education process that I agreed to be connected to, because I was thrilled that Canadian Geographic chose to look at Canada 150 plus 10,000, plus 15,000, plus 20,000, and recognize that what was really important to celebrate was the knowledge, the history, the culture, the practices, the skill of Indigenous people from their own voice in this country.
We will dive in and of course, show everybody the atlases, which are spectacular to look at, and you've got other things as well. But a little more background before we start. You're part of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How did that play into all of this?
So I coordinated the education days for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then served as the first education lead for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. We really are seeing movement across the country. We're now 2.5, almost 3 years post TRC final report. Human beings are interesting. They don't sort of step forward and say, we need to do this because it's the right thing and this is 150, 200, 300 years overdue. They need an initiative, a commission, an inquiry, a report, a day, something. And so the TRC and the 94 calls to action from the commissioners, that process has been really, really significant in the movement. I can certainly say in education across the country, and certainly was an important impetus for this.
So without that, this probably doesn't happen.
Well, I mean, we can't say it wouldn't have happened, but I'm going to say the chances are probably not.
Now, Julian, I want you to help us understand, because this is not an atlas in a traditional sense. This is not like the Rand McNally that I grew up with in grade school many, many moons ago. How is this different?
I mean, firstly, it's Indigenous, right? So I'm sure when you grew up in grade school, there wasn't an Indigenous atlas of Canada. So I think that's the first thing. The second piece, obviously, is that there's lots of voices in this atlas. This isn't a third-person sort of voice of God type atlas that has maps. It's an atlas that attempts to speak and does speak from the perspective and voices of First Peoples who contributed to it. And there's over, I think, 200 folks whose voices are included.
Why so important to get those voices on the record in this form?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's not a perspective that Canada's heard from quite enough. I think that's the first point that's really important. It's also, I think, important to recognize the diversity of First Peoples across Canada. There's 3 segments to the Atlas representing First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and our perspectives on many of these issues are different, and the histories and cultures that we speak from are very different. So I think having the space for many voices to speak is really important.
Charlene, how many years in the making?
2 years. 2 years and $2 million.
2 years and $2 million. And where'd the money come from?
So the money came from the Canada 150 initiative. And so some people, if you know what it takes to put something like this together, you know that $2 million is not a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Some people would say that's a lot of money. And when you put it into the context of that is 0.4 of 1% of what was spent on the party on the Hill, basically, and the whole initiative, I would say this is money very well spent.
And how many people do you think at the end of the day contributed to making this happen?
So we were trying to put together all of the numbers with the whole team, and we know that there were over 100 contributing voices to the atlases and over 100 contributing voices to the education piece, so well over 200.
I want to read something here because in the foreword, to the Atlas. Adam Gaudry, who's a Métis professor from the University of Alberta, wrote something which I suspect the settler culture would find very provocative, and I want you to comment on it. He wrote, "Cartography has long been an imperial enterprise used to claim territory and to imagine the geographic reach of empires. In its imperial usage, map-making is an instrument of Indigenous erasure." What do you think of that, Julian?
I mean, I think that Adam Gaudry, first of all, is obviously an expert on this issue, and I think we should listen to his informed and important perspective. But I think it's also very true, right? The ability of Europeans to come to different parts of the world and project their views onto it and then claim it just by, often the rights of discovery, which is, if we think about it, just because you came and you saw this land, how come that then becomes your claim, right? I think there's a lot of truth there. So I think it's, truth is also hard, right? I think we learned that through the Truth and Reconciliation process and are learning that. And, I think that it might be hard for folks to read that, but it's an important reality that we need to come to grips with.
Charlene, how do you think the Atlas countermands that attempt at erasure that the professor says has been going on for far too many centuries?
Well, what I really appreciate about this is, when you listen to Adam's words, it's really, to me, it represents that closing of the doors and sort of locking down. And the Atlas and the giant floor map and the apps and all Indigenous voice that is, attributed to this, I feel like it's the opening up of those doors again and that window to see truth, really. And for people to understand, people think they know where they live. Non-Indigenous people think they know where they live based on those lines and that erasure. And really, this is an opportunity to learn, oh, this is actually where I live. This is actually the land. These are the actual connections. This is what is natural. This is what is real. This is not what is imposed.
Now, we're looking at a little slide right now of one of the many pages in the Atlas, and that's not a typical, National Geographic or Canadian Geographic atlas. That's not what they typically look like in grade schools across the province. How did you convince Canadian Geographic to do something that would presumably be outside their traditional realm of expertise or comfort zone?
So when we first came together as the education team with Indigenous educators and some ally educators from across the country, there were two things we were really clear about. First, we asked to not see political boundaries. We asked to not have that. So there are territory lines and boundaries, but it was really important to make sure that it was the linguistic groups. It showed language groups. It showed connection to land. It showed, where residential schools were. It showed unsettled land claims. It showed territory boundaries. But we also asked, when you take a look at the timeline around the giant floor map, there are images all the way around it that come from either the First Nation, Métis, or Inuit contributors. But it still then kind of indicates that, just by representation and ratio, that most of the history in this country is still post-contact. So there's actually dots and lines around the giant floor map to show that ratio, to show that really the 150 is a tiny, tiny tail end of the 20,000 plus years.
Well, apropos of what you just said, here is a map of part of Canada, and of course what I find fascinating about this is you don't see Manitoba or Saskatchewan or British Columbia or Alberta. You see Canada divided into the different treaties and the years in which those treaties were made. I've never seen a map like this ever before in my life. And Canadian Geographic had no issues about trying to do something like that?
The fantastic thing, my experience, and I believe Julian can speak for himself as this experience, but our experience in education was that as people come forward, they're accustomed to being asked for their perspective, their knowledge, and then the organization, let's remember this is the Royal Canadian Geographic Society, come back with, that's really interesting, but we do it this way. There were no buts. Canadian Geographic listened, they interpreted, they came back and asked if they got it right. It was incredible, and I believe that is the most significant contributing factor to the success of this project. No buts, just listening, honoring, recognizing, respecting.
Julia, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that that getting this process right and getting to a product like this there's so many ways that things could go wrong or not be handled properly. And as we know, living in right relation with the first peoples of this land is very complicated, given the deep and troubling histories that we share and that we're just now coming to grips with. And I think that to the credit of the Canadian Geographic team, they didn't sort of demand editorial control. I think they ceded a lot of that to the contributors like Charlene and the many writers who contributed to the atlas and the text. I think that was really important and a model for how publications can handle this kind of thing moving forward.
So we should just point out here that this volume that I'm looking at right now smells great, isn't it? The new smell is just fabulous. This is one of 4 volumes that people can get in the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, and there are a couple of other things as well. You want me to do this tablet thing now? Okay. Okay, website first, and then we'll do the tablet. Let's show the website, Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. That's pretty obvious. Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada.ca. And it's all there. And then you've got this app, and I'm going to show my technical prowess here, or maybe not. Let's show this here. This is really very handy dandy, and am I getting this on camera okay, guys? And then you go up, and here across the bottom, as Julian mentioned earlier, Métis, Inuit, First Nations, Truth and Reconciliation. Let's just click on one of these here. Watch how this bursts on. Isn't that beautiful? Look how that comes up. And then, of course, there's just more information as you go further down. There's just so much to dive into here. It's really quite fabulous. Looks gorgeous, too.
It's beautiful.
Looks gorgeous. It's really beautiful. What are your hopes for this thing?
So from an education perspective, my hopes are that this atlas is in every classroom across the country, at least one copy, that every teacher, and we're hearing a lot of teachers saying, I need one of these for myself as well. We have to remember that teachers were never, they never had the benefit of this education as well. But anybody who's been in school pre-TRC also has not had any of the benefit of any of this education. So I would say, education, it doesn't just happen in schools. So in every household, in every business, in every organization, it really needs to be there. And hopes also that every school district in this country gets a copy of the giant floor map and the activities and the lesson plans that go with it, so that we ship
let's
things.
put the floor map up. I think, Sheldon, we got a shot of this, don't we? Let's bring the floor map up. It's huge. I mean, it's called a floor map for a reason. It is huge.
It's the size of a gymnasium.
It's the size of a gymnasium. Look at that. And go ahead, describe a little bit of what we're seeing here.
So you'll see the timeline around the outside with the little circles of information. You'll see people standing on it because that's what it's for. And it's really intriguing to watch people engage with the floor map because it is huge. And so mostly you see people head for where they live and they're trying to find themselves on the map. So often you'll see non-Indigenous people get on there and they have no point of reference that makes sense to them or that they've experienced or are accustomed to because there are no provincial territorial boundaries, not capital cities. So people are starting to have to look for bodies of water and segments of land or First Nation communities or Métis communities they may be familiar with. But Indigenous people walking on the map is also really powerful because you see people looking at it and it's like, I see things that make sense to me. This makes sense to me. I recognize this. And there's a lot of dialogue when people get on the land, on the map, between Indigenous people from various nations and communities. Because, of course, there's not that sort of hard and fast, this is the line and we're here. There's an overlap, there's a sharing, there's gathering places, there's places that are meant for different purposes and have been significant for different reasons.
I guess, Julian, there's an opportunity for non-Indigenous people to really empathize here because as Charlene describes it, if you're a young school kid, you have been looking at a map the same way and you have a frame of reference, and as we have for hundreds of years here, and Indigenous people have not had that frame of reference. And now, looking at these maps, it's the non-Indigenous people who are somewhat disconcerted, right? And don't have the frame of reference that we've enjoyed for the last several hundred years.
That's
It's
exactly
interesting,
right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that watching non-native people, reorient themselves on
Yes.
a map, have to sort of see their home, their country in a new way is really powerful. And then, when I first encountered the giant floor map, I walked right up to where my home community is, Canham Lake, Tsikeskan.
Which is where?
In British Columbia, near 100 Mile House. And, walked right up to it and pointed at it and, took a little selfie of my feet right above it and, that kind of a thing. And I think that, to Charlene's point, I think that that's really, it seems minor, right, to see the land in a different way, but I think actually, imagining what that will do for kids in 10, 20 years down the line, I think it can be quite powerful.
Well, I don't want to imagine. I want to know right now. When you see Indigenous kids stand on that map and see the land, Turtle Island, if you like,
Yes.
in a different way from the way they've seen it before, what do you see?
So I was able to witness a colleague that teaches in Gatineau. And the school that she teaches at, a lot of children come from the James Bay area, and so Cree children, and they were so excited. And kids will just get right down there and they'll crawl on the map and they'll look for things, and they saw their own communities for the first time. And it's so exciting, and they see their languages, and they're proud because they see other kids that have no idea and look to them for that explanation of what is that and the knowledge, and they see how excited their teachers and their fellow students that are non-Indigenous are about this learning because it's not been available.
I spent a little time at Manitoulin Island during the summer, and 40 years ago, when I first went there, there was a place on the North Channel called West Bay, and today it's called Chiging. How much of that is happening across Canada right now, where the original names are starting to be re-employed?
I've seen it a lot, especially in the north, in British Columbia, close to where I live, for example. It used to be called Hobima, and now it's called Muscatcheese.
Tell that story. Why was it called Hobima?
You know what? I don't know why it was called Hobima.
I think, if I remember this right, I think it was that the settler who named the place in Alberta many moons ago decided that he liked a Dutch artist named Hobima, and so he named it after this Dutch artist, which, was a nice way for him to pay tribute to this artist, but it sure didn't have a heck of a lot to do with the Indigenous history of the area. But now it's called Muscatcheese.
Which I do know why it's called Muscatcheese.
Go ahead.
Because that's Bear Hills, and the area is called Bear Hills. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't know why the white guys called it Hobima, but I do know why
Leave it to the
Cree
white guy
call
to
it.
do the white history. That's all right. And are you seeing this as well across the country, where Indigenous names are sort of reclaiming their place, never mind in this atlas, but in common parlance as well?
Yeah, no, I think increasingly in obviously Indigenous communities this is happening a lot, but also right here in Toronto, for example, right? People are reclaiming Tuckerano as sort of the name of the place. And I think that, firstly, that's really cool. But, to reorient yourself on the land that way, to see people try to struggle with the pronunciations of a lot of these things, it's a coming to know where you are and where you're from in a different way that can, I think, change perspectives.
Can you speak your Indigenous language?
I was very fortunate to, our language is called Secwepemc, and my kia, my grandmother, is one of the last fluent speakers on our reserve. She's a residential school survivor. She teaches in our Eliza Archie day school.
This in BC?
Yes, in BC, and I was very fortunate to study with her for a few summers. So I'm not fluent by any means, but I've had the opportunity to sit with her and work through those really complicated words and phonologies and learn how to say things, and we can have a little back and forth in our language. And given what happened to her and what happened to our people, the fact that language was quite literally beaten out of her and many of our ancestors, and that I can speak some of that and that I can maybe someday share that with my children, that means the world to me.
We should probably hear what that sounds like, since I suspect 99% of the people watching this right now will have never heard it before. Say something.
Yeah, well, so we're speaking in the morning, so the morning greeting the traditional morning greeting in our Secwepemc language is Chuchwinuk, which
Chuchwinuk.
Yeah. Oh, that was actually really good. So yeah, Chukwinuch, which doesn't actually literally translate to good morning. It means you survived the night. And I think, reflecting on what our people survived, the many nights that our people didn't make it through the night, and how profound it must have been, and how deep and dark it must have been to say that to someone when we were in the midst of that devastation. I think that's part of what you can get from learning the languages, right? Is like that texture, that human experience, that knowledge of what our ancestors are going through and what it means to know that today.
You don't say good morning, you say, I survived the night.
Or you survived the night.
You survived the night. That is profound. Charlene, tell us how Indigenous languages have been used in this project, on these atlases, on these maps.
So again, I'll speak more to the education side of things. And so on the giant floor map and on some of the maps, language has been really important. So when you see the colors, you see the nations, but it's also by linguistic group. And so some of the things, that Julian refers to about the differences. So in some places on the map, you'll see Cree spelled C-R-E-E. In some places, it'll be C-R-I, depending on how the nation itself spells. And we have to remember that First Nation languages, Inuit languages, were not written languages originally. So, we're people...
Not written, only spoken.
Only spoken.
Okay.
So there are linguistic groups, but there are also many different dialects, so...
I don't know if you can see this. We want to zoom in on this because, again, I think a lot of people have not seen what these languages look like. Here, James Bay and Northern Quebec agreement in English, and then...
in syllabics.
And now what is that Ojibwe on top of that, or what is that?
Well, so your James Bay Cree, right? So the Cree speakers there, that would be one of the written forms of their language. And so they use syllabics in that area.
Wouldn't that be neat to teach that language in schools?
So, there are places in Nunavut where the children are actually educated in Inuktitut up until grade 3. And then, so that's such a gift that many communities, many schools across the country are really aspiring to, in that resurgence of language.
Well, actually, I was just looking for Sault Ste. Marie on this map because I think in the school system in Sault Ste. Marie, I think you can take Ojibwe as an elective and learn another language. I mean, now obviously,
You can do that in schools in many places across the country. Blackfoot Cree, Nakota, Ojibwe, Mi'kmaq, Dene, like the list goes on.
Yeah, we're all used to French and English, but to learn an Indigenous language as well would be kind of neat. Let's finish up by quoting you back to you, shall we? Here's you in the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. It would be an egregious mischaracterization, however, to paint the Indigenous experience on this land as solely tragedy. There is triumph here too, especially in recent generations. After decades and even centuries of struggle, self-determination, not assimilation, is the zeitgeist of contemporary Indigenous Renaissance. Julian, let's finish up on that hopeful note. How is that Renaissance playing itself out today as you see it?
It's playing out in so many different ways. I mean, here in Toronto, you can go to many of the art galleries and you'll see some of the beautiful works of incredible, Native artists. I think that's one avenue. There's in many communities now, you'll see kids who are growing up with their culture. I was just in Bella Coola actually for Canadian Geographic, and there's kids there participating in their potlatch, doing their sacred dances. That's, that wasn't happening 50 years ago. So that's a big deal. Those kids will have kids and those kids will dance too. You have folks like me who have the opportunity to learn their languages from grandmothers who went through some of the darkest things that have happened on this continent to maintain those languages. You have writers who have the opportunity to contribute to things like an Indigenous Atlas and who are writing fantastic books, some of which get made into movies nowadays. And of course, there's also a growing political element to this, right? There's increasing presence and change in the political realm that's being driven by Indigenous peoples. And I think all of that is for the better, not just for us as First Peoples, but for all Canadians and maybe beyond.
I have no hesitation in saying to any teachers or principals or school board trustees or librarians, school librarians who are out there, $75, I mean, it would have been a bargain at twice the price. And, one in every school library seems like a reasonable thing to do. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for coming into TVO tonight and sharing your views on it. The Canadian Geographic Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. Charlene and Julian, thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Miigwech.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.